Addressing Gettysburg.
So, and then it kind of expanded into, well, you know, there's a lot of cool history here, but there's also a lot of cool stuff that goes on here, and people really should visit. Mm-hmm. And so then it became, well, let's do some shows about what it's like to be here today. So we do a live stream on Thursdays called Addressing Gettysburg Today.
Okay. We're super
and
original.
Bethany is my co-host on that. I do the history shows alone. I just interview experts. And then Bethany does the live stream with me on Thursdays. And it's a little more, well, it's a lot more lighthearted and goofy than anything else. So this is kind of a mix. It's a mix of history and just having fun. Because it's a fun time here. All right. Are we ready there? Oh, I guess, yes, we are. We're rolling already. So, Beth, I'm going to ask you to hit the blue button.
From the Gettysburg Museum of History Studios.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And we are coming to you from the CWI's 2024 Summer Conference, and it is just as wild a time as you would think it is. You know, you've heard about the crazy times here, and it's living up to it. It's living up to it for sure. And speaking of keggers, we're talking about the Irish in the American Civil War. What?
Nothing.
And I'm Irish. I can make these jokes. And with us is Ryan Keating. He's from California State University, San Bernardino. Hello, Ryan.
How's it going?
How are you?
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Thanks for coming on. You did a talk about the Irish in the American Civil War. And everybody knows about the Irish Brigade.
Sure.
A good chunk of Civil War buffs probably know that there were other Irish regiments on both sides, that were not obviously part of the Irish Brigade. Why don't we know about them as much, in your estimation?
That's a great question. So if you look at numbers, like 150,000 Irish fought on the Union side, and 20,000-ish maybe on the Confederate side. But those numbers are kind of hard to trace from the Southern perspective. And you know, on top of that, when you look at places like New Orleans, a lot of the Irish that enlisted or were forced to enlist in New Orleans, when Butler's Expeditionary Corps landed, they all joined the 9th Connecticut. So in one of my regiments, there's all these guys from New Orleans who are fighting for the 9th Connecticut. And there's some correspondence that suggests that they all knew each other prior to the war, so that they knew each other either in Ireland or then were in New England together, and then some of them went down south. But I think that just the emphasis has always been on the Irish and the Irish Brigade because it's sexy. If I can say that on this podcast, am I allowed to say that?
You can definitely.
Okay.
Yes, we're all about
sure.
sex on this podcast.
I think that New York has always been the place of focus for anybody that wants to study the Irish. There's the 69th New York, Thomas Francis Meagher, who's rises to prominence and then falls off a steamboat in Montana, or is pushed if you believe the conspiracy theorists. But
What do you believe?
I think he was drunk and he fell off.
Yeah.
Now,
But I hate Thomas Meagher. I think he's a horrible person.
Right. I just wanted to make sure here. Ryan Keating, that's Greek?
It is.
It is. So you can't be making those jokes.
Greek Orthodox.
Right.
In fact.
No, that's a very Irish name. So he's also allowed to make these jokes.
Yeah. So
correct.
just because my last name is Yingling, I can't make any jokes.
You gave away your Irish heritage when you changed your name.
I didn't have an Irish name to start with.
Well, then what are you getting at?
I'm getting at it shouldn't matter.
No, it actually doesn't matter. I don't care what you are. You can make the jokes. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
so I don't like Meagher because Well, the reason I started studying the Irish in the Civil War was I did my master's at Trinity College in Dublin, and I became enamored with the Fenian movement, which is a group of Irish nationalists that tried to create a transatlantic movement. So they were organizing in secret in Ireland, and then they were openly organizing in the United States. And the idea was that the liberties provided by the United States allowed them to train in public, and then they were going to go back to Ireland. And the founder of the movement, James Stephens, hated Marr. He felt as though he was what he called like a drawing room patriot who was using the idea of Irish nationalism to enrich himself in New York. So there was a lot of animosity there. And I think for a lot of Irish nationalists at home and in the United States at that time, it is true that Marr really capitalized on this phenomenon to propel himself into fame. And at the end of the day, he was not a great leader, and he I'm sure that there are scholars out there that would be like, oh my God, you
blasphemer.
Yeah, but I think that his leadership of the Irish Brigade, which he took over after Michael Corcoran, who was really instrumental in the organization of that unit, came as a result of Corcoran's capture, and then Marr maneuvered himself in there, and then on top of that capitalized on his role in the 48 rebellions. But anyway, I think that there's just this fascination with the Irish in Boston and the Irish in New York, and we forget that the Irish lived in other places.
Oh, definitely.
So on Marr, and now I'm not an expert on the Battle of Fredericksburg by any means, but I think I read somewhere that he gave the men this rousing speech before they went up the slope, and then said, like, when the battle is the fiercest, I'll be there with you, or something like that, and then didn't go up because his knee hurt.
He was conveniently absent.
Yes. So is that one of the reasons you don't like him? Is that true?
No, I don't like him because I think that from a historical perspective, I think that I don't know if it's true or not, because other people say that maybe he had a little bit too much to drink. But I think that he was I forget. I can't think of the word.
Like a charlatan. Like what? What?
Charlatan. Maybe. I mean, he was part of Young Ireland, and this uprising happened in 1848. He was exiled to Van Diemen's Land. He escaped to the United States in the 1850s. But I do think that to a point, he was not as invested in the cause of Irish nationalism as we might assume from his leadership. He was more invested in himself.
He's like an opportunist.
An opportunist. Yeah. That is the right word.
Okay.
He used it to make himself look good.
Yeah. No. And to make himself. If you believe the Fenians and James Stephens, he used it to make himself a lot of money. There's this James Stephens who is himself. He himself is an interesting character, but he's penniless in New York. He's come over to New York to raise money for his movement in Ireland, and he's penniless. He doesn't have a place to stay, and he's standing on the stoop of Marr's brownstone, and he's looking at this, and he's like, how does this guy have so much money? And Marr won't see him, and he's angry about this, and he's like, look at all this money that this guy's that managed to make off of the cause of Irish nationalism. And then Stephens like, I'm penniless because I really just believe in the cause now.
Well, that is true though. Like the true believers are always the ones poor, right? Because they do it for love of the game.
Sure.
Yeah, I can buy into that. So, the Irish, from what I heard from my grandfather and stuff, and my great grandparents came over here in the early 1900s. And the Irish weren't treated that great back then, but it sounds like it was better, even a little bit better than it was in the 1800s, the mid 1800s. But Hollywood really likes to play up.
Sure.
Really everybody's suffering, no matter who they're depicting. It's always like the worst version of their situation. And this came up in the lecture, and I'm sure you get this all the time, and I'm sure anybody watching this at home is probably thinking of Gangs of New York at some point in this conversation, so let's just get this out of the way. There's this scene of Irish people coming off the boats, and they're immediately signed up, enlisted into the army. was that literally true? Was that symbolic of something? Like, did that really happen? Or are they trying to just get a message across with an extreme example?
I don't believe that it's true.
So like, there's no case of
not that I've seen.
Okay. I mean, it sounds like a good idea though. If you want to recruit
Oh my
guys,
gosh.
Sure.
no, I'm
right?
saying
I
like
mean,
if you're trying to recruit people, just stand there on the boat and be like, hey, you get clothes on your back and you get $10, $12 a month, whatever you get.
Yeah, I think that this idea emerged, at least, from the Irish perspective, to really reinforce, like, we were treated poorly during this time, and we had nothing. We had so little when we arrived here that we had to enlist to make ends meet. Or to reinforce this notion that the Union Army was really an army of conscripts, right? And this comes from the lost cause narrative that says, we would have won but for all these men that the Union forced into service and compelled to fight against us. And I think that the reality is twofold. Like, number one, immigration petered off during the war, right? So there's not a lot of men coming into the United States during the war. But number two is that there's a lot of opportunities that open up as a result of the war, right? So the idea that these poor immigrants arrive and the only option that they have is to enlist in the army is so it's just not correct, right? Because there's jobs that are open in industry across the north that these men can funnel themselves into, and there's ways of getting out of military service if they want, right? But it is a compelling image.
Do you think they may have created that image later to make it themselves look like, hey, I am so patriotic to my adopted country that I did this immediately. Like, I believed in this cause so much. I am so American.
Yeah, I mean, but the message in Gangs of New York is that the Irish are they don't know what's going on and they're sort of tricked into service, right?
Yeah.
That they're so ignorant of the situation that they're compelled because they just sort of like stumbled upon it.
Like, they had no idea when they left Ireland that there's a war going on.
Yeah, which is false.
Right.
But also, I think that if you think about 1863 onwards in terms of the men who are going into service unwillingly, right? Because that's what we see 1861, 1862. There's a lot of patriotism. 1863 on, there's soldiers who volunteers who are either compelled because of the draft or are paid by other men to take their spots, or are shamed into joining. Right. The idea that somebody would just come off a boat and just be forced into or sign their it just is not realistic given the situation.
What do you think was the motivation? Okay, so they weren't treated well here in the United States, Irish.
In some places.
Okay, in some places. Right. Where were they mistreated? Where were they not mistreated? In a general sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at the focus of nativist rhetoric, it tends to be on sort of these urban centers, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, the places in which the Irish, some Irish immigrants ultimately crowd into these slums where there's not a lot of work, and then also this is compounded by like lack of sewage, lack of waste removal, alcoholism, and so it's very chaotic, right? I mean, I don't think that you can downplay just how bad some of these places were, right? And there's epidemics that break out in places like Boston and New York, typhoid fever, for example, that decimates the populations there. And so this becomes a focus of some, white Anglo-Americans, but it's in part tied to the Irish, but it's also in part driven by sort of the fundamental changes that are going on in American society at this time, right? So the Industrial Revolution kicks off. You have really sudden, in many ways, changes of these urban spaces, and the Irish appear to be sort of part of God's wrath or punishment for these social changes, these economic changes that are going on. I don't think outside of these areas there's as much of an emphasis on the Irish or the fear of the Irish for a number of reasons. Like if you look at Chicago, for example, Chicago has a large Irish population, but the Irish were there from the very beginning, right? From the moment Chicago it grows, and it grows rapidly, you know, in the 19th century, the Irish are there. They're part of that growth. There's a need for artisans. There's a need for skilled workers to build the city, and you know, at the end of the day, they're not as alienated, right, from the rest of the population. And then as you look in other places, you know, the Irish arrive with everyone else, and they build these spaces, right? They build the canals in places like Earlville or Ottawa, Illinois, and then they stay. And I really see a much more a friendly relationship based on, you know, reliance on each other. There's not as much of a sort of animosity that exists in those areas, and we have to remember that, right? Because New York was bad, and the nativists, you know, mistreated the you know, they really focused on the Irish in New York. They focused on the Irish Catholics. Nativists won the governorship in Massachusetts and Connecticut in the lead up to the Civil War. They disbanded militia in Connecticut that were made up of the Irish. But, you know, apart from that, right, are the Irish in places like New Haven getting, you know, stoned as they try to go to work? You know, no, not really. It's nativism existed, and it's bad, but it's not, I think, as impactful on a daily basis as we tend to imagine it being, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. There's examples of that, I think, today, without bringing up modern politics. I mean, I can think of places in New York where certain people are not allowed to, say, go into their classrooms right now. Mm-hmm. So, yes, but everywhere else in the country, they seem to be okay. Yeah,
and I mean, even if you look at current political rhetoric about immigration, right, there's you know, anger by some segments over immigration, but does that really play out on the local level, right? Are people really... we like to imagine historically that they were, right? I think that we tend to idealize the past, and we tend to think like, well, everybody in the United States was aware of these huge issues that were going on.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, you know, most people were just trying to make ends meet, right?
Just like today.
Yeah. And so while it may have been in the background, I'm not sure that it's appropriate as scholars to be like, well, nativism defined the lives of these men and women. Because, I mean, even in New York, my guess is that it didn't.
Yeah, only in election years.
But isn't that the way, though, that the extremes of a generation define it? I mean, I think of the 1960s, and those of us who weren't alive then think of the hippies. Mm-hmm. But you talk to, like, most people I know from that generation, they hated the hippies. They weren't hippies. They were regular people who were trying to figure out how to make their lives work. And so the vast majority, nobody's writing songs about, I went to my job in the office today, and like, you know, you know what I mean?
Well,
like,
yeah.
And nobody's making movies about that because they're too busy with the regular job.
Yeah, really, until 68, right, until the Tet Offensive, there were more pro-war demonstrations in the United States than there were anti-war demonstrations. Right. And even at the height of the anti-war movement, they say maybe 25% of Americans were actively anti-war, right, which isn't a large number. And, of course, Nixon won the election on the idea of the silent majority, right? So I think you make a great point. And I think that the problem is, as historians...
I just made a face at the camera like, see, I make a great point.
Make a great point. But as I think as historians, there's something like compelling, like, oh, right... Well, we don't want to say there was not nativism, right? Because if you look at the history of the United States, you want to say, okay, there are these moments in which, and we can track over time, there were these really vehemently opposed groups that did not want the other, whether that be Irish, Chinese, Germans, people from Central and South America. Yeah, Jewish, right? They didn't
whoever
want
the new people were.
They didn't want them here, right?
Whoever was different.
And it was impactful, right? And you can't deny that. So it's important that we talk about it, but we also have to, we have an obligation to say, yeah, this was present, but, right, to the average person living in Sandusky, Ohio, face that, right? So you have to do a good job balancing that narrative in order to give, I think, the full picture of how people experience the past. Otherwise, you're being disingenuous.
Right. So then my follow-up question was going to be, what do you think the motivation was of the Irish to fight and die for a country that was not good to them? But your answer, though, I think answers that question is it wasn't that bad to them, just in areas.
Yeah, I think that there were leaders, political leaders, that said this is our moment to prove our worth, right? I mean, Marr, Corcoran, even James Mulligan in Illinois, like there was this idea, right, that we can prove our worth to the nation from a big picture level. But I think that if you look at the guys who actually volunteer, right, they're volunteering for a host of reasons. And the hard thing about studying the experience of immigrants in the Civil War is we have so few sources that that guys say, well, this is why I enlisted. And in fact, the one source that's always pointed to by scholars is Peter Welsh. He's the color sergeant of the of Massachusetts, the 28th Massachusetts, I believe, and he writes in one letter to his father-in-law that in fighting, what is it? I'm not going to quote it, right, because I'm going to get it wrong, but he says, in fighting for America, we're fighting for Ireland's freedom, right? That without the United States, there would be no hope for Ireland, right? And so people are like, wow, that's why they fought. But the problem is, if you look like 3 letters earlier, he writes that he only enlisted because he came home from work and spent all his money getting drunk, and he couldn't go home to face his wife, right? So that was his, like that on that day was his motive for enlisting, and then he had this more intense epiphany about Irish nationalism as he's fighting, and people change, right? I think too, and I tell my students this, is that people's opinions change all the time. Like we tend to think, oh, somebody in the past, they were so dead set on their ideas that they never changed. It's like, well, that's not true. Like you look at Twitter right now, or whatever it's called, X. Yeah. Right. Somebody can tweet one thing one day and they can change their mind the next day. And
a lot of people do that.
Yeah, but you think that people were you think people were different in the 1860s? No, absolutely not. So why did men enlist? It's a combination of things. I think that they were excited to go fight. They wanted to join their friends. They were the ones that chose to enlist in an Irish regiment chose to enlist. I mean, there was something intrinsically appealing about the Irish regiment with the green flag and the pomp and circumstance, and this idea that I'm joining a regiment that's better than. It would be like somebody wanting to play for the Red Sox over. I don't know. Does Toronto even still have a team? Right? The
hell do I know?
Yeah, we don't do sports.
Right. Anyway, so
no, I'm not into hockey.
Say Pittsburgh.
Sorry.
I don't even know if the Pirates are good this year.
They're not. That's why I'm bringing
have they ever been? But the point is,
shot across the port bow.
But the point is, I mean, you want to go and play for who you love, right?
Can I bring up my sports analogy from earlier?
Oh, please.
Okay. So this is the thing I found so fascinating about what you were talking about today. So you pick these 3 regiments that are not traditionally considered Irish Brigade regiments, and their percentage of Irish people from Ireland in it, if I'm looking at your talk today correctly, was low. Was less than 50%. Say that accurately.
The further west you go, the less Irish-born men are in it. So in the 9th Connecticut, there's around 60% are Irish-born, but in Illinois it's less, and by the time you get to Wisconsin, it's around 30%, which is significant.
Which is an insane thing to think about when you think in that case 70% of them were not. Mm-hmm. So my sports analogy, which he thought was ridiculous, was in sports, if you are in a school and football is the predominant thing, and only 30% of the population plays football, that's a part of your school, but it is not the school.
Sure.
Okay? So why in this case is 30% of the population the regiment?
Yeah. I mean, I think that if you look at, so when you break it down, right, and you look at the men who are, for example, at the officer level in the companies, they tend to be Irish or of Irish descent.
Okay.
And if you look at the hardest thing, I think, for scholars that do the history of immigrants in the war is like, how do you know who's, Irish but born in the United States?
Yeah.
And so when you start to look at it from that lens, the number gets higher. So there's a lot of men who are born in the United States who then join these Irish regiments who you can say with a degree of certainty that they had Irish ancestry, right? And so, in order to find that, I went through Ancestry.com has this really cool algorithm where you can enter a last name and it gives you the percentage of where they might have come from, right? Mm-hmm. So you enter Keating in there and it says, well, it's 70% likely that somebody from Ireland, right? So you can say, okay, well, if you look at it from that way, because in the past people just were like, well, let me look at that last name and see if it sounds Irish, and it's a horrible method.
Yeah.
And so when you go from that angle, right, a high number of the American-born men had Irish ancestry, greater than 50%. But then the question becomes, well, did they really enlist because they felt a connection to Ireland, or was it just something really cool? Like, why do I study Irish history? Because my dad used to play the Clancy Brothers when I was little, and my great grandfather was from Ireland and may or may not have supported the IRA from San Francisco. This is the family lore, right?
Mm-hmm. Nice.
And I thought it was cool, right?
Yeah.
So then I study Irish history because it was cool. I thought it was cool. I still think it's cool. So did these guys like enlist because they had this deep connection, or were they just like that's a cool thing to do? But then to complicate these issues is that, when you look at the Irish, the children of the Irish immigrants, right, they're indistinguishable from white Americans, white Anglo-Americans. They don't have an accent. They don't dress in traditional Irish clothing. They go to church, certainly, or the Catholic Church, that differentiates them. But they're not going to be facing the sort of nativist backlash that the guys and men and women who are getting off the boat, in places like New York can potentially face, because they're indistinguishable, right? So that brings a whole different sort of lens on it, because you're saying, okay, these are people who, they're indistinguishable from white Americans. They choose to join this regiment, but they're not.
So do you think it's culture that off the boat they've got a different accent, they have different traditions, they have different ways of, just everything is different, but their children are raised here, and so they only know the way we do things here. So do you think the nativist problem, and I guess this really goes throughout history with any time a new group is getting pushback, is it because the culture is different, the culture they bring? It's not the skin color, it's not the language per se, except that it's part of a different culture.
Yeah, I think that in the Irish case, right, it's the culture, it's the tendency to drink, right, which is seen,
which is fun.
It is fun, but it's also seen as destabilizing, right?
Oh, because, it's that too, yeah.
There's this focus on, well, the Irish men go and drink, and then they're not there for their families, and then they live in poverty because they spend all their money on drink.
But the same thing can be said for German Americans. And in their case, they spoke a completely different language.
Yeah, but we
don't have a German brigade.
We do.
We do. What are you talking about? There's a whole corps of them.
Yeah, but when I say Irish brigade, you know who I'm talking about.
Right, but even
when I say German brigade, you're like, which one?
Right, but even that though, and I think this is kind of the point that you were trying to make too before about the Irish regiments. It's 30% of the regiment, let's say. But it's the largest demographic in the regiment, correct? So, like, if you have
right.
There's no other group that has more than, or at least 30% in that regiment.
In Wisconsin, the Germans are almost there, so it's almost equal number of Irish born and German born in the 17th Wisconsin.
Wow.
Yeah.
See?
So
your theory is wrong.
Well, then they would call it an Irish regiment because the Irish are more fun, right?
That's right.
That's right. We're more fun than the Germans. You guys are too serious. We like to have fun. We joke around. We drink. You drink, but you're not fun.
I do think that there's something. I do think that there's something to that. I think that there is a cultural link between the Irish and fierceness
Frivolity.
on the battlefield. If you look at like
a wild fierceness.
well, there's a whole history of these wild geese, these men who were exiled from Ireland who go and fight in European armies and do so, and they're incredibly successful in these European wars, and then they come over to the United States, and I think that at least early in the war, there's a lot of success, right? The 69th is responsible, if you want to give them that much credit for saving the Battle of Gettysburg, right? Their rearguard action as the Union troops retreat to D.C. and then the 23rd Illinois at the Battle of Lexington is, they're revered throughout the United States for their tenacity under fire, and then people want to follow in the lead of those.
Yeah.
Whereas the Germans are the Flying Dutchmen.
Yes.
Well, but also you guys are all about order, and it's like
Heaven forbid.
Who's the fun guy in Mel Gibson's Army and Braveheart?
The
Irish guy. Okay. And then the Scots are pretty fun.
And let
but
me
the
tell
Irish
you,
guy was really fun.
the stereotypes are not
Wrong.
they're not wrong. I mean, when you look at the 9th Connecticut they're out of control. So when they leave New Haven, they go to Lowell, and the people of Lowell are so afraid of the Irish getting there and what they might do that they organize their own militia to prevent the Irish from rioting. And then they're in Camp Chase in Lowell, and they become known as the Connecticut over the fence regiment because they'll jump over the fences in Camp Chase and chase the local factory girls, right?
Yeah.
So then and then like newspapers
reminds me of all my family reunions.
Newspapers come out and they're like, well, once they're under Butler's command, they'll get an order. So then they're put on boats. They're sent to Ship Island, which is in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's like one of the soldiers writes, "It's a place more desolate than Robinson Crusoe's," right? And so they get into order for a little bit, and then they get to New Orleans, and it's just like it is just pure chaos. Like
Mardi Gras every day.
I've read all the court martials for these guys, and there's like one where a soldier was drunk and he threatened to kill the officer, and then another soldier said, "Did you think that your comrade was drunk?" And he said, "Well, no, sir, because I don't consider someone drunk unless they're face down in the street." This is in the court martial proceedings, right? And it's out of control. And then, of course, the colonel of the regiment, Thomas Cahill, he is part of the temperance movement, right? But he in his mind, temperance is just hard alcohol. So he's writing home to his wife about how much wine and beer they have, and he's they're having like these grand parties in these houses that they're occupying. And it's there's no regiment that has a higher number of court martials than the 9th Connecticut does, mostly from their time in New Orleans.
See, the Germans never get into that kind of trouble. I'll bet you, up and down the line, you can't find a group of Germans that are that fun.
I'm gonna.
Now,
say.
are they doing anything bad while they're doing this? I don't want to, praise them if they're
court-martialed.
Well, but you don't get court-martialed for anything.
They're getting court-martialed for threatening to kill their officers. So basically,
so
what happens?
Nothing. Terrible.
So the problem that the guys in the 9th Connecticut see is that their officers are allowed to drink, but they're not. So a lot of the animosity comes because they say, okay, this guy who they were equals prior to joining the military. Now he's a captain. He can go get drunk. And that's what it says in the court. Like there's one where, a guy says, you're nothing to me. Why are you allowed to go get drunk and I'm not allowed to go get drunk? And it plays out. It's very interesting, right? This ethos of republicanism that you see in the ranks, where they're like, that's not fair. Just because you're a captain, you're allowed to get drunk and I can't.
Well, he's right? But that's so funny that they would go to such extremes over that.
Yeah. Well, they're in New Orleans. What else is there?
Well, that's true.
Now,
Go ahead.
Bringing it back to this frivolity, I want to point out that the two most popular pop culture representations of an Irish person during the Civil War would be Buster Kilrain and the dad in Gone with the Wind.
Mm-hmm.
Neither one of them are frivolous, drunk Irishmen. You can almost say both of them are a moral compass in that movie.
Well, I think that's fantasy, right? Would you agree?
But that's how today's like this larger than life moral compass, fierce fighter that is the Irish Brigade, the Irish man.
Well, you know what I think.
Army.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong. I have a theory as to that, as to why that is. Because those are works done in the 20th century, and the Irish were assimilated more and accepted more, not totally, into society by then. Many of them were writing great works, or, knew people who were doing good things or whatever, and they were making films, they were writing books. What's the name of the woman who wrote Gone with the Wind?
Margaret Mitchell.
Margaret Mitchell? I mean, Mitchell, what could that be? Could that be Irish?
Could be.
Or English? Or maybe she's a mix? I don't know. But my point is that, over time, I mean, look, eventually we had an Irish president, Irish Catholic president.
Yeah.
They killed
I
him, but
agree.
we had one, right?
Yeah.
So
The stereotypes change, right? Like
Right.
But
the
there's
quiet
still-
man.
Yeah.
which is
There's
great
still
fun, a lot of
both
drinking and
these
fighting in that.
stereotypes.
Yeah.
There's both of them.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating to me.
But I think that Hollywood likes to take a formerly oppressed person and work them into a story and make them wiser than the oppressor, or make them wiser than the hero, or something like that. We see that in movies all the time, and it's all different groups and types of people. And I think that's just a thing they like to do. But you're the actually educated person, so you tell me.
I don't know if I have an answer to that, but I do know. I think Gone with the Wind is
She's Scottish. Margaret Mitchell's Scottish.
But it's odd the whole the opening, right, where they're at Tara and the dad's talking about the importance of the land and everything. That's very Irish in many ways. But then I'm like looking at it, it's like I don't think that this is realistic in terms of what would it's very weird, right? That link to the Irish in Gone with the Wind, I find it odd.
We watched that a few months ago for Film Club, and it was the first time I had watched it in years, and I never caught that before. But then I was like, would an Irish guy be this successful in antebellum South?
Certainly, some were, right.
They had to have been, right?
Yeah,
That Mappy showed Georgia.
Patrick Claiborne, for example, was incredibly successful in the South. You have a lot of, especially Irish Protestants that come over, right?
Yeah.
That actually had access to money. So I don't think it was too crazy. But I just found, I've seen that film a few times recently, and I always find it very odd, right? This deep it's very Irish stereotypical, deep sentimental relationship to the land that they have to hold on to, and then that defines the whole narrative, right? Because that's all what Scarlett O'Hara wants to do, is she wants to hold on to Tara, which is in some ways is very Irish, but it just seems very out of place in that, like how they're making that connection. I don't know. Maybe somebody smarter than me.
I did notice that your map had little green spots.
Yeah, right. Like
Georgia.
Savannah's
Right.
a huge Irish enclave. They have the largest St. Patrick's Day celebration in the country. So the Irish go there. They go to New Orleans, right? But it's really just these port cities.
Is it mostly Protestants going to the South and Catholics going to the North, or is it more of an even?
No, I mean, I think it depends on where you're looking. So the primary ports of entry are right during the famine era: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and then up in Canada, because it's cheaper to get to Canada. Because there's the United States has. They enforce regulations on the ships. So the poorest of the famine immigrants go to Canada because it's in the British Empire, and there's no regulations. And then to the U.S. ports, there's more control, and so the tickets are more expensive. And I think that if you look at like Savannah and New Orleans, they're getting immigrants there as a result of just the fact that they're port cities, but it's not in the numbers that you see in New York, and the opportunities are less than. New Orleans has a sizable Irish population, and they caused a lot of problems for the Confederacy in the early part of the war. There's labor disputes. Many of them are conscripted into the Confederate militia. There's accounts of at Fort Jackson and St. Philip is mostly supported by Irish troops, and then there's accounts when Farragut runs the guns, it's because the Irish troops in the forts don't want to fire on him, so they're tilting the cannons up so the cannonballs roll out, and then they set off the powder. And then when you look at the 9th Connecticut, actually there's they have about 150 guys from New Orleans that enlist in the 9th Connecticut because of their Irish connection, and because the colonel said they know each other. It's very weird. When the 9th Connecticut lands, there's a parade of Irishmen, and then he writes home that we've seen a bunch of friends that we haven't seen in a long time. So
wow.
Where those relationships came from, were they in Connecticut and then the guys went south, is unclear. But
Interesting.
yeah.
Ryan, you're working on a book right now?
I'm working on a project. I don't know if it's a book yet. Yeah, I want it to be a book. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is it now?
So it looks at pensions of widows.
Okay.
So what happened is that of all the men in the 3 regiments that I looked at, there were only 5 letter collections of the 5,500 men that I look at. And so I used to freak out in grad school, right? So I'd be like, what the heck am I going to do? How am I going to tell the story of all these men when you only have 3 letter collections, right? And what I ended up doing was looking at the pension files of these soldiers. So I pulled around 1,500 pension files of the soldiers in the regiments, and in the pension files, what we find is these very rich stories of the men, their families, their communities. As they try to prove their wounds and wounding, they have to tell their whole history. And so I started to look at widows' pensions, and I had some undergraduate students working for me as part of a summer program, and we were looking at widows' pension. I was just looking at widows' pensions in the North because it fit what I was looking at with the Irish. And one of them called me one day, and he was like, "Have you looked at the pensions of the USCT?" And I was like, "I never have. It wasn't on my radar." And he was like, "They're amazing. You should check them out." And indeed, they are. They're incredible, and I'm forever grateful that this student. Sometimes undergraduate students don't want to make suggestions to faculty. They're nervous about it and stuff like that. But he was adamant that I look at them, and so the project looks at sort of the ways in which black women in the South navigated slavery and freedom, and the also at the same time the ways in which white Southerners attempted to restrict black social and economic growth through the use of the pensions.
That's
so
fascinating.
yeah, it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool stuff.
So you're trying to turn that into a book?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah, someday.
Well, good luck with that.
Thanks.
And when you do, let us know, and we'll have you on to talk about that. In the meantime, thank you very much for coming on. I enjoyed your talk today. It was very nice meeting you.
Thank you.
Yes.
And
so much.
thank you, everybody, for watching. And stick around. We've got more coming whenever the hell I put them up.
All right.
You don't have to hit it right away, but...
See, that wasn't bad, right?
No, we could go on.